Welcome to the Cyber Leaders Podcast with me, Ciaran Martin.
And me, James Lyne. Now, we're both from the SANS Institute who are kindly backing this podcast. I myself am a massive geek, and I've spent my career chasing cyber criminals around the internet.
I'm not a techie. I led on cybersecurity policy and operations for the British government and set up the National Cybersecurity Centre. But now, this combo of James and myself are trying to unpack for you the weird and wonderful world of tech security and all the complicated challenges it brings us.
Easy peasy, Ciaran.
Yeah, of course. And last time, we learned how cybersecurity works in one of the most complicated organisations anywhere in the world, the BBC. And I'm not sure our last guest, Helen Rabbo, will be pleased with this segue, but today I think we might turn to crime.
Well, that sounds like a lot of fun, Ciaran, but we probably should do the podcast first, shouldn't we?
I mean, talk about crime on the podcast. Cybercrime.
Well, of course. Well, look, on this podcast, we talk a lot about cybercrime, how companies defend against it, the consequences of it, what policies the world might consider to thwart cybercrime, and, of course, what security leaders can do to reduce their organizational risk.
Interesting, but what we haven't actually dug into very much, and not many people really dig into this, is the actual criminals and how they do their evil deeds.
Good point. And of course, we should. I mean, look, cybercrime is just such a huge business, a growing business as we all use more technology. And of course, parts of it are really sophisticated, sometimes technically, but more often than not, it's more often the sophistication presenting in how these folks organize their businesses.
It's almost like the most successful digital enterprises in the world should be called crime.com.
There's a book about that. In fact, Ciaran, that's the exact title.
There is a book about that, and it's brilliant. And the same author has also written a really amazing book on the North Koreans who give us the gift that we've come to know as WannaCry, one of my favourite, i.e. not favourite days in government. So The Lazarus Heist, one of the most popular cyber books of all time. The podcast that preceded it, I'm told, reached number 1 on Apple Podcasts in the UK, number 7 in the US. That's a bit embarrassing because I'm not sure we're going to attain such heights.
Well, look, there's a new book out as well, Rinsed, lovely title, all about how criminals are using technology and the new financial systems to steal, move, hide, and spend money.
Well, I think maybe we should meet this author. I've heard some chortling in the background, so I think he's there.
We most definitely should. Well, look, someone I've known for a long time, and you as well, Ciaran. Let's say hello to the brilliant investigative journalist, Geoff White.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Well, look, Geoff, thanks so much for joining us. James, how do you and Geoff know each other?
Well, Geoff and I go quite a way back, actually. You know, Ciaran, we've talked many times about how cybersecurity has ended up in the limelight. When I got started in this stuff, it was off in the corner of IT, and the notion of hacking or all these different cybersecurity disciplines was long off into the future. There was very little coverage by journalists. And of course, we fast forward to today, and it's a frequent topic in our headlines, a matter of national policy. We've got the World Economic Forum prioritizing things like misinformation and discussing these issues above some of the other big challenges the planet faces. Geoff and I met back in the formative years of some of this stuff, and he did a phenomenal job of bringing challenges that many would in some ways see as a bit geeky and hard to access to the limelight. So we did some fun work raising the profile of wireless security issues, people having kind of bad default wireless passwords from their providers and their networks being blown open, as well as covering some of the developing parts of the cybercrime marketplaces, even as far back as Alpha Bay and the developing credit card sales market and similar, tracking down people who've been impacted. So Geoff, I think, was one of the shoulders giants that the modern knowledge of cybercrime was built on for our industry. I love you for that, Geoff. Thanks for helping with that journey.
Thanks, that's really kind. Yeah, we tried our best. Tech generally, but tech security particularly, is not an easy task to put onto TV news. You know, there are very few pictures, and having to come up with sort of scenarios to get these issues over to people was difficult. And you actually really helped with that. You were a great interviewee, very fluid, very cogent, very understandable. So the love goes in both directions there.
Fantastic. So that's what you were doing 10 or more years ago, getting people like James to explain some of this complicated tech security, doing it yourself, doing a great job. So you're a very respectable journalist. But as far as I can tell, in the 2020s, with crime.com in 2020, the Lazarus Heist in 2022, and Rinsed this year, you spent an awful lot of time just investigating some of the very worst people in the world, geeking out on crypto scams, digital heists, the dark web, horrific crimes as well that are much more serious. So I just want to know, how did you get into all this side of this stuff?
Well, when I was working at Channel 4 News, when I met James, It was the year of the product launches, the Apple product launches, and Steve Jobs was still alive and he'd present the iPad and the iPod and whatever. The problem we had was tech at that time just seems like the funny cat story at the end of the program. There's two problems with that. I mean, number one, I didn't get into journalism to do funny cat stories. I got into journalism to, make a difference and have an impact and expose wrongdoing, ideally. And secondly, if you're in that zone at the end of the program, you're in the relegation zone, you're in the drop zone. Because if something more important happens further up the program, you get dropped off the end. So we got dropped a few times and it really annoyed me. So I thought, well, we need to get to hard news. We need to start investigating these things. And just started looking around and started realizing that technology was the scene of and the facilitator of a great deal of crime. Criminals tend to lurk at the fringes of society. Cutting edge technology is at the fringes of society. So it made perfect sense that criminals would tend to adopt new types of technology to commit their crimes. So we started covering these kind of things. We hit kind of a seam there. There was the Snowden leaks, there was the anonymous hacking, there was the hacking of Sony Pictures Entertainment, there was WannaCry, as Ciaran's mentioned, the traumatic WannaCry incident. And so it just kind of developed from there. As societies become increasingly technologically dependent, inevitably more crime happens through technology, and inevitably there's more stories for people like me and others to pick up on.
A trajectory that I think we can all agree is going to continue. Not like the genie's going back in the bottle. More and more technology, and sadly, I suspect more and more crime. Although, Ciaran, you had a tone of surprise that one would want to spend time in a dark room studying cyber criminals. I find that personally baffling. I can't think of anything better to do on my weekends. So I'm with you, Geoff. Well, look, let's get into the detail of all of this stuff, shall we? And talk a little bit about the cybercrime ecosystem. So first up, Geoff, and it's a big question, from all you've researched and written over these many years, give us an overview of global cybercrime. Who are these people? What do they do? And why are they so successful at inflicting pain on us?
It's a really good question. It's a very, very broad question, that, obviously. I think broadly what I was trying to get over in my first book, Crime.com, was roughly speaking, you had sort of three groups of computer hacking force, if you like. You have the nation-state hackers. Every government now employs computer hackers. Every government worth its salt, certainly, who carry out nation-state attacks. Sometimes that's espionage. Sometimes it's just a modern twist on what they've always done. Other times it's more destructive. You've got organized crime who've obviously moved into cyberspace. And what's been interesting is watching not just sort of organized cybercrime, but organized crime in general, drug dealing, fraud, prostitution, people trafficking, becoming increasingly sort of technological or technologically enabled. And then at the lower level, you had sort of hacktivist type movements. So people like the anonymous movement, just sort of have a go type people who play fast and loose with the law. Often they're saying, well, look, we're doing this to kind of expose companies' vulnerabilities, but actually, well, frankly, you're hacking them. What's interesting has been the sort of crashing together of those three different groups. So you've had nation state groups learning from and utilizing the tools and tactics used by organized cybercrime. You've also had nation states learning from the hacktivist movement about how to make hay with your hacks and how to make headlines with your hacks. You've had organized cyber criminals sometimes working with and on behalf of nation-state hackers. So these three groups are sort of melded together. In Star Wars, you had the Mos Eisley spacebar, which is famously where all of the sort of a wretched hive of scum and villainy, I think it's described as in the script. And I sometimes wonder whether in cyberspace there's the equivalent where all these groups get together. But what you've seen is this increasing collaboration between these different types of groups, borrowing each other's sometimes tools, borrowing each other's tactics, certainly, to kind of increase the impact of their hacks. That's broadly speaking what we've seen. What's interesting is my new book, Rinse, that takes some money laundering as part of this scene. Money laundering is really, really important for most of those groups, certainly the organized cybercrime and organized crime element. Because frankly, if you don't have a route to launder the money, if you can't escape your money, you don't do the crime. There's no point stealing the money if it then sits in a bank, unobtainable, or is clawed back by the victim. You want to escape with the money. And if you can't escape with the money, you don't steal it in the first place. That's what made me want to concentrate on that money laundering piece of this.
Chase the money. By the way, I've been in a few of those bars. Now, they may not be physical places, but there are online forums for sure. And you're absolutely right that the trading of software platforms for crime, I think, has been probably one of the biggest accelerators of technical competency and scale of cybercrime of the last 15 years. I remember when this stuff was an art and people wrote malware to show off how clever they were. And now this stuff is commercialized and scaling and software update and quality assurance. It's got to be a big factor.
And Geoff, I wanted to just come in there. I mean, that was fascinating. And I think some of the most interesting work, people like James and myself sometimes think of this, isn't this an interesting cyber phenomenon? But what I think you've explained is this is criminals and they're using the latest technology like other people only for nefarious use. And that's a much more enlightening way of approaching it. But before we get too far into some of the things around money laundering, I know you can't reveal your sources and you won't want to say too much about how you do your work, but could just ask you how you go about it in general terms. I've read Rinse, it's brilliant, but you've had to put basically trigger warnings on several chapters because of the absolutely horrific activity it involves. So how do you get access to information about these pretty horrific sets of individuals? Is it dangerous? How do you find the information?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wanted to tell people and really show people in the book that money laundering is not this white collar crime that people think it is, where, nobody really suffers. It's all spreadsheets and numbers and money moving around on the internet. No, people actually really suffer with this. So some of the subjects I've concentrated on in the first few chapters is cartel drug dealing, prostitution, and child sexual abuse, which is obviously where the sort of trigger warnings come in. I want to say to people, look, these crimes don't happen unless they can get away with the money. If we can stop money laundering, arguably a lot of the most horrific crimes in the world that really affect victims in life-damaging ways could be brought partly to a halt. So that's what I wanted to try and get across. In terms of how I sort of go about researching that, the book was difficult in that previously in things like the Lazarus heist, I had a narrative, like a chronological arc to go through. We follow the Lazarus group from their earliest days right through to their most recent stuff. With Rinsed, it was slightly different. I wanted to get over an industry and how an industry works. So there's no one group of money launderers we're following along. There's no chronology to it. So I was trying to explain how money laundering works as a sort of technique. There are some key steps that you take in the process of money laundering, which is described in the book. And, these are well studied by academics. They're not secrets that I'm putting out. But I wanted to show how technology was changing sort of each of those steps. So I'm trying to think, well, okay, for each of those steps, for each of those chapters, I need a story to concentrate on. I love a boy's own adventure. I love a story. I love a tale. I love the twists and turns. And also that's when you get people involved. So for each of the chapters, I'm like, okay, what's a story I can tell that will get over the gist that I'm trying to get over in this particular chapter? What I then do is go about looking at what everybody else has written about that story, if indeed it's been covered, trying to read as much as possible. And I start thinking, well, who hasn't spoken? Who do we want to hear from? Who are the characters that I'd want to hear speak about this? Who was witnessing it firsthand? And secondly, what are the bits of this story that are missing? What bits haven't people squared off? What are the loose threads and loose ends here? So what I'm looking to do is trace this story really from its very, very earliest beginnings, the kind of little tributaries of the river, right down to where the river sort of hits the sea, to follow it along from beginning to end. And it's interesting, as you put these things together, you realize, well, hang on, no journalist has discovered that bit. And journalists haven't really looked at that. Why has nobody covered this bit? And there's a whole missing bit of the narrative here. And that's what I'm trying to put together. So I can satisfyingly tell somebody a story from the earliest days right through to the most recent stuff in each chapter.
It's interesting as well, Geoff. I mean, you're following the stream all the way through. I love that visual. You could tell you're a storyteller. In the security industry, we often talk about the chain of attack and breaking the chain at the earliest point possible. But for most people listening, security leaders and technical security practitioners, our analysis of this stuff stops long before where you are trying to pursue. We worry about prevention in the first place, or limiting the damage, stemming the bleeding of the attack. And sometimes we venture a little over into the payments side with ransomware and similar, but it's a very front-loaded set of activities. And I do wonder sometimes what lessons we might learn as practitioners on the technical side if we were to follow that a little bit further and think a little more holistically about our attackers. Which, by the way, sounds like a wonderful sales pitch for your book. You should probably put that in a quote and get that up on a book site at some point soon.
Do you know what's really interesting is through doing the book, I've ended up covering financial crime as much as cybercrime. And in my mind, those two things didn't seem like they'd be that different. They are completely different industries. I turn up to financial crime conferences. I have no idea who these companies are. I don't know any of the speakers. But when they start talking and they start covering it, I'm thinking, hang on, you're just doing the other side of the equation. The cybersecurity guys over here are covering this side. As you say, James, often front-loaded prevention, incident response and so on. But the financial crime guys, they're the ones looking at the other side of, once the crime is committed, where's the money gone? And there's a whole other side to this industry. And I really think if those two industries could come together somehow, I think there's really room for some kind of conference of bringing together cybercrime and financial crime, because there's so much they can learn from each other. It's almost like they're fishing on different sides of the pool for the same fish and aren't even aware of each other. The practitioners are different as well. Those of the cybercrime folks tend to come from tech background, IT management, maybe ex-military, ex-police. The financial crime guys tend to be sort of compliance, lawyers, data protection officers, but there's loads they can learn from each other. I've really started to think that recently. That's something we should try and do.
Well, let me pick up on that, because I think you said, Geoff, you were looking when you were doing your work as to things that other journalists weren't examining. And it's just a guess as to why that might be. But I think you might have hit upon part of it, which is that cybercrime journalists will understand one bit of the equation, but they won't really understand complex financial nexus. But you've learned both. And I kind of wanted to ask, how much did you actually have to learn? I mean, Lazarus Heist, it's really accessible. The podcast especially listens like a sort of thriller, episode by episode. But there is, layman's technical explanations of some quite complicated stuff that you understand. Equally in Rinsed, you've set out very accessibly the very, very complicated manipulation of the global financial system. So how much did you need to get technical and really learn stuff that you didn't previously understand to produce these books?
Jeff's a secret massive geek, Ciaran. He knows like 8 programming languages. Rumor has it he could take down a satellite using his iPhone if he wanted to. That's what I'm stating.
Yeah, all right. But did you learn global banking as well as all of that massive geekery?
Well, after I'd mastered Fortran, I thought, what's the next challenge? No, it's an interesting position to be in that I feel as a journalist, you need to understand enough of the tech to be able to talk to the techies and enough financial crime to be able to talk to those groups of people. But I fear if you know too much and you get too entrenched in it, you lose your ability to translate that across to the general public. So you need to stand in the middle and enough to be dangerous, but not enough to do any real harm, basically. I need to know conceptually how these things work. There is a certain point in the technical reports. I'll read, reports from Mandiant and Sentinel-1 and people like that and Kaspersky. And it's interesting. I usually make it about a third of the way through the report, understanding what's going on. And then they go off into, dynamic link libraries and all that stuff. I'm like, no, you've lost me now. But as long as I understand that first third, I can A, get it over to the public, but B, ask the techies the right questions. And again, James, you've been on the receiving end of this as a journalist, trying to get gifted, skilled people to talk in non-technical terms. I mean, terms that you use all the time, like DDoS. The public don't understand what that means. You've got to get people down into sort of, easy to understand terms. But that's my job as a journalist, is try and get that over and get that working. I have to say, I'm really proud of what we did with Lazarus Heist. The idea that in sometimes, as Ciaran, you said, highly technical podcast was fighting toe-to-toe with the likes of Joe Rogan's podcast for a place in the charts. We went above a Line of Duty podcast in the charts at one point. Like, that's really impressive, and credit to us as producers, but credit to the public for sort of wanting to follow that through and understand that techie stuff.
Well, James and I can only dream. I wouldn't get too ambitious about this one, Geoff, but thank you for joining our niche little recording.
100%. Jeff's going to lift our ratings, no doubt, Ciaran. We have a rock star in our midst.
Excellent.
But look, I think there's great lessons there. And I think they're lessons that apply to security practitioners because, of course, Geoff has attempted to translate technical subject matter to the general public. But a lot of the folks listening are attempting to translate very technical subject matter to business professionals, to talk to finance professionals and executives. And they really are the general public in terms of their general expertise. So I think the art of asking these questions, translating, simplifying, watching how you storytell is something that a lot of security practitioners looking to develop their connection to their business and their understanding of the work they do is something that, folks should prioritize. So journalism and security leadership may have more of an overlap there than people at first think. Let's jump on a little bit before we entrench too much into the global cybercrime ecosystem. It'll still be there for years to come for us to come back to, sadly. Geoff, in the introduction to Rinsed, you promise readers, I'm going to show you how technology is putting rocket boosters under the money laundering industry. And then you do literally that. I mean, looking at everything from the Escobars of Medellin, how money laundering fuels the horrors of drugs, human trafficking, child exploitation. You take us from Manchester to Nigeria to Vegas casinos. Quite the world tour. Notice there hasn't been any money laundering on the moon yet. Little disappointing. Opportunity for a follow-up. But are there common themes to how all this stuff works?
Yes, it's interesting. So one of the things that, go back to Ciaran's point, actually, what I've learned, one of the things I've learned about money laundering is you've got to think about what you're looking for as a money launderer. So imagine you've got an unhandy amount of money that's criminal, that's burning a hole in your pocket, possibly virtually, possibly physically. You're looking for some way where you can launder that money. You can effectively break the connection between the money and the crime that it was connected to. Well, you're looking really for sort of 3 things. You're looking for somewhere where there's a lot of money sloshing about so that you can drop, let's say, $1 million of drug cash into that marketplace and nobody bats an eyelid, right? So you're looking for lots of money, lots of valuations going up and down, like a febrile marketplace, right? Secondly, you're looking for international. You want to be able to drop your money in London and extract it in Los Angeles. And the third thing you're looking at is lack of regulation. You do not want police, regulators, governments sniffing around what you're doing. So those are three things you're after as a money launderer. If you think of what tech, and particularly tech startups, like to do, you think of Uber and Airbnb and all these kind of companies, they want a marketplace where the valuations are all over the place. I mean, how much is an Uber taxi worth? Nobody knows. It could be loads, could be not much. NFTs, the values of these NFTs, these crazy sort of crypto assets, wild valuation fluctuations, millions going through. Nobody knows what anything's worth. Brilliant. Okay. Secondly, international. Yes, a tech startup, they want to scale globally. Uber wants its service to be equally available in Mumbai or Manchester, right? And the third thing, lack of regulation. Well, yes, tech startups love places where there's little regulation, where they can challenge the regulations and set up shop so nobody stops them in their sort of quest for global domination. So it's not that tech companies and tech startups want to make money laundering easy. It's just the kind of things that tech startups and techies like to do, the kind of activities and businesses they like to set up, just happen to be exactly the kind of things that money launderers are looking out for. They don't want to work together. It's just they end up inhabiting the same sort of territory. So that's been really the big learning for me, as to how there's a natural reason why technology and money laundering go together. They are just natural bedfellows.
With great disruption comes great opportunity for economic growth and crime.
Yes. Yes.
You heard it here first.
'Twas ever thus.
I think that's a really interesting observation and frankly aligns to what we've observed in the moving sights of cyber criminals over the past 20 years as they've evolved their means. You also said something there I think is a really important lesson. You talked a little bit about understanding motives. What do these people want? And that's something that security teams, when they're often working 105% of their available hours busy responding to everything, don't have the time to step back and do. And if they do, they often do it with a little bit of hyperbole. Now, of course, here we are talking about international crime and the stuff that sounds very dramatic, but realistically connecting with what these attackers want from you and want from your business, understanding the value of what you have and how they may exploit it, how they will, monetize it, actually really enables you to focus the work you do and where you invest your effort. So kind of recognizing you may not be the personal target of the Chinese government. You may, by the way, Geoff, just FYI. But also that there's this kind of large number of criminal gangs who are looking for fraud with kind of certain relatively mundane outcomes that are easy to money wash, helps you think about your defenses. So I think we all ought to do a little bit of what you just said in microcosm of our own security models in our own organizations and not just think of that as a global tactic.
I hate sort of giving advice to IT security practitioners because it's not my job and I don't want to sort of be teaching people how to suck eggs. But
we're all ears, Geoff. We're all ears.
You are part of a much bigger business. The way the public perceive your business, whether your business is liked or disliked, how you're doing in the news, how your organization's culture is, are you a unified company? Are you spread about? All this stuff matters to your sort of security posture and your attack surface. So understanding, how the business is moving, how different departments are moving, having your sort of ears up to what else is going on in your building beyond just a sort of IT security department, I think is really worth doing, because if nothing else, it will help you explain to those people what you do. People in HR, if you explain tech security to them, you're going to want to do that in a different way to how you explain it to the board or, how you explain it to sort of salespeople out in the field or folks working in a factory. Just understanding that you're part of a big business and how those different bits of the business move and work, I think is helpful just generally for folks.
Yeah. And look, I think given what we're doing here, that was pretty good advice to cyber defenders. Even if you said it's not your job, it's better than plenty of people whose job it is. So thank you for that. We might come back to that. But let's go back to the storytelling point. So The Lazarus Heist is a terrific story, really, really gripping. Rinsed is all sorts of stories. Which one would you pick that you could sort of summarize briefly that you think really illustrates the nature of the modern money laundering program? What's the most gripping and evocative story about this problem in the book?
I think, what I was looking for was a payoff chapter to the book. You're always looking for like the showstopper ending that brings it all together, and like that thing in a musical where everybody comes on stage and they all sing and dance. I really wanted that at the end of the book. And so the final chapter that I wanted just came together in the Tornado Cash Axie Infinity hack, which I'm sure some of your august listeners will be familiar with. 2022, it's alleged North Korea's hackers broke into a Vietnamese video game called Axie Infinity. I'd never heard of this game, but it turns out it was massively popular. It's worth about $2 billion, or the company that made it was worth about $2 billion at the time. Hackers break in. They used a job phishing exercise, offering a potential career to one of the employees of the company to encourage them to download some malware, which they did. The hackers break in and they managed to work out that the whole game, all the money really in the game, was in the form of cryptocurrency. So a bit like Bitcoin, basically. All the players in the game were trading stuff back and forth. It all moved across a kind of blockchain, effectively a public ledger. The hackers realized all of this and realized that if they could take over that ledger, they could steal the money. And that's exactly what they did. They took over the ledger and they managed to steal $625 million, which is a serious contender for the biggest theft of all time. If you look at the amount of money stolen in one go from one victim, judged at the time of the theft, it's hard to find an example more than 625 million. And even if you can, nothing beats this for speed. This is the fastest crime of all time because stealing the $625 million took 1 minute 55 seconds because it's all in the form of crypto.
I think I could improve on that. I mean, there's a PR to be had there.
You can get it under a minute, can you, James? Okay.
James, you're being recorded.
oh yes. I mean, hypothetically, I couldn't possibly comment.
But what's interesting is, obviously then the North Koreans, if indeed it was they who stole this stuff, are then sitting on $500 million worth of hot crypto. Where do you go? You can't just pitch up to like Kraken or Binance or whatever. They're going to ask some questions about that. And also there's not really the liquidity there to kind of change that money. So the North Koreans went to a thing called Tornado Cash, which is a mixer, a crypto mixer, which mixes the money around, the crypto around with other people's crypto and then spits it out to a fresh wallet address. And that's exactly what they did. They dropped about 455 million of the stolen money into Tornado Cash, which mixed it around, and that money is now gone.
So that's the equivalent, Geoff, is it, of running a laundrette, but for Bitcoin?
Exactly. The useful thing about that is what it gives the attackers now is time. The key thing about money laundering is to give yourself time. At the point where you've stolen the money and the cops are on your trail and the banks are tracking you, the clock is ticking and you're sweating. As soon as you laundered the money properly, you've got time. No one can catch it. No one can find it. So then you can eke it out. You can put a bit of money here. You can withdraw a bit of money there. It gives you that breathing space. And that's what the North Koreans allegedly have got now, is breathing space to launder that $500 million. Use a bit of it here, use a bit of it there. Now, what's interesting is you would have thought Tornado Cash, is a dark web service that's creepy and only for criminals. No, it was a clear web, open system set up by a bunch of engineers to give privacy to crypto users. Their idea was, look, all crypto is traceable. So you need this mixer if you want to make your transactions private. So, you can hide what you're doing, which is your right as a citizen. And these money launderers came along, the North Koreans, and laundered $500 million. The folks behind Tornado Cash said, well, yes, but that's kind of one of the costs of doing business. We didn't want them to launder money, but these things happen. It gets abused.
That's the way it is.
So they're now fighting back against the US government that's tried to shut them down, saying, look, we just set up this privacy-preserving system. You can't blame us for, the system being abused. If someone gets stabbed with a knife, you don't blame the person who made the knife. You blame the person who did the stabbing. So there's this epic freedom of speech debate going on within the US about this laundering of $500 million by North Korea. This story has everything. It has crypto, it has video gaming, it has North Korea, it has freedom of speech, sanctions, the US Department of Justice. It's everything. It's like somebody presented me with the biggest Christmas present of a story to pay off the book with. Astonishing tale, and still going on in the courts.
It is an astonishing story, and the book's full of astonishing stories. I think that's also my favourite, but I have a soft spot, if that's not the right phrase, which it clearly isn't, for the story of the two sisters from Bury in Lancashire running what looked like an extraordinarily mundane operation, but laundering ridiculous amounts of money in hugely complicated ways. I think, given that it's based here in the UK and looks so innocuous, it's an absolutely fascinating story, which I recommend. But I wanted to ask, given all of this, and I know you said it wasn't your job to give advice to cyber defenders, and you'll probably say it's not your job to give advice to governments either. But on the back of the book, Sir David Omand, one of my old bosses, former head of GCHQ, former national security advisor, says, gripping and surprising true crime drama without a happy ending so far. He'd been involved in defending the government against the accusations in the Snowden leaks. He knows an awful lot about this stuff. But he also said in reviewing your book that cracking down on money laundering should be central to our strategy. And you mentioned police forces, you mentioned law enforcement, you mentioned the lengths these people go to evade detection. Is there anything public policy can do about this stuff? You've mentioned the fact that Tor is designed by the US military and so forth, and it's all misused. Are governments getting this right? Are they passive? Is there more that you think governments can and should be doing to at least put a dent in this unbelievable ecosystem that you've exposed?
Yeah, it's difficult. It is difficult for governments, and I sympathise, because one thing about cybercrime and the money laundering that attends it and also attends other types of crime is it's international, which can make it feel like it's always somebody else's problem. And that's why the US is interesting, because the US quite aggressively pursues prosecutions and things around the world. Tornado Cash and the Axie Infinity job that I've just talked about, arguably, still had nothing to do with the US in inverted commas, but the US government still went after them because it's okay. North Korea is sanctioned by the US. There will be customers of Tornado Cash in the US. So the US is quite on the front foot about this sort of stuff. But for a lot of other governments, and sometimes the US, the international crime scene seems like sort of somebody else's problem to deal with. For law enforcement, there's also this challenge of the fact that when you finally get to the culprit of this crime that you're investigating, for this person who could be in, Leeds or Edinburgh or wherever, they turn out to be in some other jurisdiction. And even if they get arrested, even if you can work out with that other jurisdiction, that other country, to arrest them, which is not always easy. If the culprit's in Russia, for example, not easy at all. But even if that arrest happens, doesn't show up on your crime numbers, doesn't show up on your arrest sheet.
Indeed.
So what's the incentive for sort of law enforcement, in the UK to do that? Things like the National Crime Agency are good because they're not just based on, arrest numbers. They are looking, more broadly. And the NCA actually recently has done some amazing work around sort of DDoS attacks and around ransomware gangs and so on. So there are those collaborations. I think the main thing that policymakers need to do is, and this is kind of a weird point, but I think will make a difference, is just understanding more about the tech behind this, whether it's the tech the criminals are using, the tech the money launderers are using, the tech that the banks are using. Because then when you come across these stories, you're not starting from scratch thinking to yourself, what the heck is Bitcoin? How does money laundering work? What's a mixer? You've already got a little bit of knowledge and you've started to speak the language that those folks talk. And I think one of the big problems I see is miscommunication between sort of policymaker side and the sort of tech practitioner side, because they're speaking quite literally a different language. You see this a lot actually in AI. I find it quite interesting in AI. There's the whole politics, policy, ethics, governance type side of AI. They talk a particular language about AI. Practitioners of AI, when you actually try and read these sort of complex technological explanations, they're talking a completely different language. Those two groups need to understand each other. And I think it's a bit the same in cybercrime and financial crime. The people on the policy side need to just start reading those blogs, reading those websites, being in that milieu of the techies and understanding that language so that when you do meet these people and need an explanation, you've got a bit of ground knowledge and also you can talk to them in their language. Vice versa, the techie side need to understand there's a policy game afoot here. There's geopolitics, there's, international relations and so on. Your techie thing that you invent in your sort of office or your spare time will have international ramifications. Tornado Cash was a project put together by 3 blokes, but guess what? They're not exempt from the international ramifications of what they do.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that's a +1 from me because as someone who's sat around government tables for years, if there's a terrorist incident, you don't spend half of the meeting briefing people on how terrorism works and so forth. You get to grips with the response. Similarly, military activity, aircraft carriers, whatever it is. Whereas when it comes to cyber, when it comes to financial crime, when it comes to money laundering, often there's a sort of tutorial element to it first and foremost, and that's just a poor use of time.
So interesting.
And also, I think that you find then the technologists sometimes just overbrief or they brief in ways that cannot be understood. And also, I think that applies to the commercial boardroom as well. But James, I think you wanted to come in, but that was a fascinating answer.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely fascinating and packed with good advice. A couple of thoughts from my side and one recognition. Geoff, you touched on some organizations that are doing some phenomenal work here. And it's a real joy, kind of 20 years on into my time in this industry, to see international organizations managing to work across borders. These takedowns where there's kind of concerted effort for search and seizure in different geographies in parallel. The quality of the work is exactly what we need to make life harder for cyber criminals. To all government organizations, you need to continue to push for that, continue to fund it, praise it, and add oxygen to those types of initiatives, I think, Geoff. Definitely love that praise. 2 follow-on quick thoughts, and I promise, Geoff, we'll start to get towards a wrap-up. I know we've been quizzing you endlessly. Look, I think your point on this kind of multidisciplinary, non-siloed approach to things is really prescient. It is an absolute challenge within our industry, even within technical disciplines, that the forensics people stay separate to the offensive people, separate to the offensive folks, the cloud folks, and so on and so on. bringing together those different groups, exchanging skills and perspectives, bringing together, within an organization, the PR, marketing, legal, technical folks with the executives to do the right job in the moment of a breach.
Yeah.
Technical folks trying to reach over the line and learn storytelling and clear communication. These are going to be crucial steps for a problem that isn't just technical. It's policy, it's social, and increasingly is the very fabric of everything we interact with in every moment of our lives. So I really want to underline that point that you're making there. And lastly, it's a quick one. People, cybercriminals are innovative. They hide in the shade. We do great work and occasionally expose some, but on average, they benefit from anonymity on a very open internet that's kind of hard to track them down. We need folks with the right skills to work in the right organizations with the right capabilities to share intelligence faster and faster. The people behind these successes do phenomenal technical work, be it forensics, incident response, offensive, and other. We as developed nations here need to make sure we have enough of those folks to keep up with our appetite for technology. You named AI. We need to have all eyes on making sure we have a pipeline that is bigger and more effective than our adversary, or we won't be in the business of having good explainer conversations about our wins because we won't even have the intelligence to look at. You'll have no one to talk to, Geoff. And then where will we go for coffee and debate cybercrime? Lovely points there, Geoff. And I love the recognition of the hard work some of these agencies do. So look, hey, as promised, at the end of every episode...
And Geoff, this is James's idea, not mine.
Look, I think it's only fair that we ask for people that listen to us, get something useful at the end.
So we're asking you, Geoff, for...
your 30-second takeaway.
So I know you said you don't dispense advice, you're a journalist, but given what you know and what you've seen, if there are people listening to this thinking, I just want to avoid this whole mess in my organization, what are you going to tell them?
I think my advice would be, what is your organization? Try and have chats to people, if you can, over lunch or coffee, reach out to other departments and just understand how they work, what their sort of pain points are, what their pressure points are. Try and understand where your organization sits in the public imagination. If you're in sort of the public sector, where do you sit in terms of how government regards you? Try and get an idea of like who you're working for, which sounds an odd thing to do, but it gives you an idea of why attackers might attack you. And if they do, what's going to be the most harmful thing they could do? I think sometimes organizations look at their kind of crown jewels and different departments will regard that in different ways. Like I say, if you work in HR, the idea of the most devastating cyber attack you can think of is going to be very different to if you're in marketing or if you're the chief financial officer. But if something happens, you need to understand, okay, that's critical because it affects this bit of the business. And I've chatted to that person in that bit of the business and understand that's really important to them. So just getting your head kind of above the parapet a bit and having a look around, I think generally will just help position you a little bit better. And if nothing else, you'll learn how other people's worlds work. And that's worth doing generally, I'd say.
Well, that's just brilliant. Thank you for that. Not just thank you for that advice. Thank you for coming on the podcast, but thanks for your work. You've really illuminated a whole side of digital malevolence that normally doesn't get that attention that it deserves or gets it in a silo that's away from the cybersecurity profession, but it's completely fundamental to how it works. So that was just brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. Thanks, James. Thanks, Ciaran.
I always find Geoff just so insightful, that different perspective. I think it really helps us think about what cybercriminals want and form better tactics as a result of it. Just amazing stuff, right, Ciaran?
It's been a long time since I learned so much in such a short time. But that's our last guest of the series. We're done.
Well, you say that. I mean, I feel like we need to have a bonus issue. An off by one error, as us nerds might say. How about we pick one of our favorite topics, Ciaran? You know the one I'm thinking of.
I've no idea what you're talking about. You talk about expert nonsense and techie physics geek stuff. What are you on about? What are you actually proposing here?
Well, you'll love it. It's a 3-letter acronym, which is on brand too. So, FUD.
Brilliant. Let's do FUD, a bonus episode just with ourselves. Our guests will be you and me.
But for today, that's it, right?
Apart from feedback.
Ah, yes, the eponymous feedback that I manage to forget every time. Look, even though we're getting towards the end of the series, there's probably going to be another one. So share your ideas with us on what you'd like to hear to help make your organizations more secure.
I'd better tell you how to leave feedback because you'll forget, James. You can go to the podcast site or email us at cyberleaderspodcast@sans.org.
I've actually nearly forgotten that already. But anyway, thank you for listening for today and looking forward to FUD next time.
Till then, keep cybering.
So from me, James Line.
And me, Ciaran Martin.
Ta-ta for now.